When Israel and the UAE signed the Abraham Accords, the question mark hovering above the signing ceremony was what would happen when war breaks and the Gulf states might have to choose between sides. I met Mark Dubowitz, the chief executive of the Federation for Defense of Democracies, right here in Tel Aviv, to speak about Israel's role in the future Middle East and the role of its biggest ally, the United States of America. Mark Dubowitz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks,
It's a pleasure hosting you in Israel. Coming from the US, looking at us, how do we look from the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, I would say militarily in Gaza against Hamas, the IDF has done a remarkable job. I mean, a better job than I think any of us would have expected 5 months ago. Two of the top 5 Hamas military leaders have been killed. 2/3 of the Hamas battalions have been dismantled. A good part of the terror infrastructure, the tunnel infrastructure, has either been destroyed or has been severely damaged. And obviously, the casualty numbers are painful and heartbreaking. But I think most military experts would never have expected such low casualty numbers, given the unbelievably difficult urban warfare environment in which the IDF is operating, the most complicated and the most deadly and dangerous urban warfare environment maybe in military history. So remarkable achievement militarily by the IDF. They deserve enormous praise. On the other hand, I think things are looking, from my perspective, like they're pretty good for Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, who on October 7th helped launch a weapon of mass distraction so he can continue to work on his weapon of mass destruction, his nuclear weapons program, which represents the most severe threat to the state of Israel.
What you're saying, Mark, is he keeps us busy here with Hamas, with Hezbollah, playing, on little currency, whereas he's producing the big thing quietly, and Israel doesn't even deal with that.
Yeah, he keeps you busy, pinned down by his proxies. He keeps the United States busy, pinned down by his proxies. The Houthis have shut down the Red Sea. Who would have ever believed that the Houthis, a terrorist organization based in Yemen, could literally shut down one of the most important waterways in the world for international trade? And essentially, the U.S. Navy today is struggling to keep it open. And Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, hundreds of attacks against our U.S. forces, killed 3 of our troops, wounded dozens more. And certainly against you with Hamas and Hezbollah, he's playing offense with the proxies. We've fallen into that trap. And meanwhile, he's on offense, we're on defense, and he's working on his atomic weapons program, essentially without any challenge from the United States or Israel.
Doing what exactly?
Well, according to the recent IAEA report, this is the Atomic Energy Agency of the United Nations, which investigates Iran's nuclear weapons program. Today, the supreme leader has enough enriched uranium to sprint to a bomb's worth of weapons-grade uranium in 7 days, about 6 bombs worth in a month, and about 12 bombs worth in 5 months. Now, that doesn't mean that he has everything he needs for a deliverable nuclear weapon. But what does he have? He has weapons-grade uranium. He has missiles to deliver it. And the final piece of that is the nuclear warhead. And there's certainly indications from what I'm hearing that the nuclear weapons scientists of Iran have already begun preliminary work on the warhead. And that would be the last piece of this. And then he would have a deliverable nuclear weapon. He wouldn't even have one. He would have perhaps numbering, maybe even dozens.
What you're saying, Mark, is while we're sleeping, or not sleeping, but busy with our domestic, internal business surrounding our borders, his weaponry group that we were so much afraid of it is practically working. And if we said in the past that it will take them between 18 and 24 months from the decision point to the delivery point, they're shortening that period of time currently, as we speak.
They're showing that exactly right. And it's not clear that the Supreme Leader has given an order to the weapons scientists or that the weapons scientists have decided on their own account to begin to do this preliminary work. But yes, this preliminary work, which is not getting to the core of the weapon, but it's preliminary and it's very important, is going to shorten that time, that 18 to 24 months that Israeli intelligence has assessed as the amount of time needed to develop a nuclear warhead.
And while we speak of that, the head of the Mossad, who's in charge of that,
is in Doha dealing with the hostages, and the head of the Israeli Atomic Agency is dealing with resettling Israel back to the south of Israel, which was ruined on October 7th. So who's dealing with Iran?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, both those gentlemen who are, great patriots of the state of Israel are doing very important things. I mean, getting hostages back and redeveloping the South, which was destroyed on October 7th, are critical things for the state of Israel. But the most severe existential threat to the state of Israel is Iran's atomic weapons program, and that needs to be the national priority for the prime minister, for the cabinet, and for all of the agencies of Israel to be countering that in a very aggressive way, because that's imminent.
And what about the U.S.? We've heard President Biden saying over and over again since being elected 3.5 years ago that under his shift, Iran will never become a nuclear.
We heard that from President Biden, President Trump, President Obama, President Bush. I've heard that from multiple presidents. I don't believe it. I believe Israel is alone. I think Israel has to deal with Iran's nuclear weapons threat alone. Now, maybe Israel gets lucky and you've got a president who's prepared to help. I think at most a U.S. president might help in terms of an Iranian retaliation. So after Israel strikes those facilities, the Iranians retaliate either directly or through their proxies. Maybe you got a president in place who warns the proxies, don't do it. And maybe in that way, respect counters that retaliation. But I don't believe a U.S. president is going to do it. And you know what? Maybe a U.S. president doesn't. Great. But Israel's got to be planning for the worst case scenario and be surprised on the upside, not counting on the best case scenario and be devastated on the downside.
And what about our allies, even the non-formal ones, like Saudi Arabia, who's even more afraid or concerned or disturbed by Iran than Israel, because it is neighboring Iran? What do you hear from them?
Look, the Saudis were never capable of stopping Iran's nuclear weapons program. I think what I'm hearing from the Saudis is, if you're going to allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, well, we're going to develop a nuclear weapon as well. I mean, I think in the negotiations right now between the United States and Saudi Arabia over some kind of security pact, the Saudis, I would guess, would be insisting that we want to have some kind of nuclear power, some kind of nuclear infrastructure. In fact, we want to have what the Iranians have. If the Iranians are going to get a threshold nuclear weapons state, we're going to get a threshold nuclear weapons state. So they can't destroy Iran's nuclear facility. All they can do is counter it. And that's not good for Israel, because the Saudi nuclear weapons program and an Iranian nuclear weapons program, and by the way, an Emirati and a Turkish and an Algerian, all of a sudden you've got a nuclear-armed Middle East. Everybody's a turn of the screw away from having nuclear weapons, and that could lead to a conflagration that could destroy the region.
But Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, that security pact between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. was part of a regional plan that Israel was supposed to be a key player in that.
Well, supposed to be, and then October 7th happened. And now the Saudis, who on October 6th were willing to take the Palestinian issue, not off the table, but it was a much lower priority for them, are now insisting that the Israeli government at least acknowledge the importance of some kind of independent Palestinian state. Not now, not in 2 years, but down the road, just at least an acknowledgement, because the Saudis today need some kind of political cover, given the anger in the Arab and Muslim world, that a Palestinian state is a possibility. But with the current makeup of the Israeli government and the coalition and the pressures on the prime minister from a number of his ministers, he can't acknowledge that. I think the Israeli people, understandably, don't even want to talk about a Palestinian state right now. Certainly don't want to reward Hamas for a Palestinian state. And that's completely understandable. But for the Saudis, that creates a real dilemma for them. So, my guess is there's going to be a separate U.S.-Saudi security agreement.
Which is a tragedy for Israel, because we lost everything we should have gained. And furthermore, the risks to Israel's security interests remain.
Yeah, well, this is part of Khamenei's strategy. Remember I talked about the strategy of mass distraction in order to build the weapon of mass distraction? Well, part of that strategy is also to kill any opportunity for mass normalization. And that's what Israel was heading towards with the Abraham Accords, normalization with Saudi Arabia, which would have opened up normalization for the entire Arab and Muslim world, or most of the Arab and Muslim world. It was going to be a huge existential threat to the supreme leader of Iran And with October 7th, he is at least best case stalled it, and worst case for Israel, killed it in its crib.
And how far are they willing to go vis-a-vis Iran, between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Do they will to deal with Iran? We've seen negotiations in the past year. We've seen agreements, but still they remained very cold ones. Do you see them warming up relationships with Tehran?
Look, they don't trust Tehran. They certainly don't trust the Supreme Leader and the IRGC. They recognize what a threat it represents. But today, MBS's priority, Mohammed bin Salman is the crown prince. His priority today is this Vision 2030, this idea of establishing Saudi Arabia as a significant economic and diplomatic power. And that means significant foreign investment. And his priority is to keep Iranian missiles out of his cities and out of his mega and giga projects. And he figures the best way to do that is to talk to the Iranians, maybe even start to encourage investment in Iran, and keep the diplomatic channels open so that the Iranians will be less interested in sending missiles into Riyadh and more interested in sending missiles into Tel Aviv.
Given the current very cold, disturbing relationship between the Israeli administration and the American one, between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, how can you fix it into a very constructive working plan that will stop Iran?
It's a great question. Look, if I'm not the prime minister and I'm not the president, but if I were either of those gentlemen, I'd reach out to my counterpart and I'd say, look, we got a lot of differences. We got a lot of things we need to iron out, but we got to work together. And we're the only two countries on earth who can stop Iran's nuclear weapons program. So we need to put aside our differences. We need to focus our security agencies, and we need to cooperate meaningfully on a plan to stop Iran's nuclear weapons development. Because, by the way, Yoav, at the end of the day, Iran doesn't just want long-range missiles to strike you or Saudi Arabia or even the Europeans. They want an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear-tipped warhead that can strike the United States and our homeland. That's the threat that they represent to the United States. So,
first we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin.
That's it. First we take Tel Aviv, and then we take Manhattan. And it's a severe threat to U.S. national security. So it pains me to see our commander-in-chief and your prime minister at odds right now over many, many issues, which I think could be resolved fairly quickly if they would focus on the big priority and the single biggest threat to American and Israeli national security, which today is Iran's nuclear weapons ambition.
Mark Dubowitz, interesting and very important words that need to be heard in Israel and outside. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.